The Stalker games are quite famous for their cut content, and among the stuff that was removed during development, there is one particular faction, which is a fan favorite. Sin, also known as the Dark Stalkers. Hello Stalkers and welcome to the Anomalous Dugout. This time we will talk about the Dark Stalkers. This video will be divided into 3 parts. First of all, we shall take a look at the original concepts for the Sin faction and the Dark Stalkers that can be read about in design documents but were ultimately never implemented in the game. Then we will present a few instances when the Sin faction was brought back into the game via mods, and how these mods decided to depict the Dark Stalkers. Finally, I will share my own personal ideas on how GSC Game World could successfully revive the Dark Stalker concept in the upcoming Stalker 2. That being said, let's begin. The evolution of Sin and the Dark Stalkers during the development of Oblivion Lost, the game that would become Shadow of Chernobyl, is not an easy one to track. Sources are few and sometimes unreliable, not to mention the fact that the concept also changed in the minds of the developers while the game was being worked on. However, the main idea looked like this. Stalker Group Sin, also known as Dark Stalkers. These are zombie-like stalkers who used to be religious fanatics, believing in divine essence of the zone, the last expiation of the humankind. Conflict with all stalker groups and attack any stalker. Dark Stalkers wear black coats and hoods so that the face cannot be seen. If you remove the hood, you will see a bald head with bloody holes instead of the eyes. From this general description we get that sinners were supposed to be dressed in trench coats, similar to bandits, but they would have acted more like brainwashed zombies, being hostile to all the other factions. Because of this, duty was on the hunt for Dark Stalkers. Moreover, it seems that the wording used to be religious fanatics is not a coincidence, as their zombie-like state is not something that was always the case. Supposedly, Build 1893 contains a text file which seems to suggest that the Dark Stalkers became zombified after falling under the control of some mutant. Anyway, we also know that the main base of the Sin faction was to be located in the army warehouses. So yeah, freedom was not there, and instead it was the Sin faction. If we read the design documents further, we also find out that one of the goals of the Dark Stalkers was to collect secret information and documents about the zone, and kill anyone who was also trying to gather such secrets. In fact, it is mentioned that the player would have tried to acquire documentation about the X-Lab experiments directly from the Sin faction. Despite the fact that Dark Stalkers are said to be hostile to everyone else, it appears that the player would have cooperated with the sinners in some way or another, and we even have a full depiction of how this encounter could have gone. God, they're crazy! Messer thought it was now difficult to surprise him with something, but when he saw the crucifix in the corner, he trembled involuntarily. At first it seemed to him that a stalker costume was hanging on the cross, or at worst, a dummy. But no, when the flame of the fire highlighted a figure on the cross a little brighter, Messer clearly saw that these were mummified remains of a man, namely a stalker, not a zombie. Above him, on the wall, one word, Sin, was spelled out, and it looks like the inscription was made in blood. About 6 people sat around the fire, among them a painfully pale one, all wrapped in a black mantle, stood out especially. This man was holding a human skull in his hand, with a sewn down parietal part, and was sipping some drink from there. The eyes in which the glow of the fire fluttered were black, frozen, and frightening like the eye sockets of the skull that the leader held in his hands. It was necessary to get in like this, Messer thought gloomily, casting a cursory glance around the surroundings. The huge room resembled a hangar adapted for a museum of ethnography. Skulls laid out in a neat pyramid, the head of the pseudo-giant in a huge glass vessel, a necklace of dog teeth hanging on the wall near the low withered rat corpses, and a strange object that does not fit in with the environment is a huge safe. All this in the wrong light of a bonfire kindled right in the middle of the room. The leader swayed and poured the remnants of liquid from his terrible goblet directly into the fire. A suffocating sweet tart smell stupefied the brain, and then they all began to sing, rather howled, and there was so much melancholy in this. Messer felt his knees bend, and he sank into a spat on the dirty floor. He perceived everything else as in a fog. It seems they also danced around the fire, periodically splashing some kind of liquid into the fire, the stupefying vapor of which made the wheel malleable like softened plastic. In general, when the performance of the local improvised folklore ensemble came to an end, Messer was ready for everything. According to the most optimistic forecasts, they should at least skin and eat him. But for some reason that did not happen. The leader suddenly raised a hand with a bracelet of teeth that looked suspiciously human, and silence reigned. "You are the chosen one," the leader said in a low, husky voice. "I feel it in the skin," Messer thought, wondering how to sell his life at a higher price, which, although it didn't enthuse, wasn't tired to such an extent that he would for nothing let himself be eaten. "You are a twice-born one," continued the leader, and Messer began to suspect that they would not eat him, at least for now. From this little story we get that Sin was some sort of death cult, practicing weird rituals, human sacrifices, and cannibalism. Speaking of cannibals, I do believe that there is one dialogue from Shadow of Chernobyl that's a relic of the Dark Stalkers somehow left in the final game. I am talking about the cannibal stalker from the Freedom faction, which can be found patrolling in the military warehouses. This character has a unique dialogue, implying that he would have liked to eat the player. In my opinion, this is a leftover from the time when Sin was based in the army warehouses, that the developers forgot to remove or left as some sort of secret. Before moving on, I want to mention that Sin is not exactly the only faction of Dark Stalkers that was cut. Supposedly there was a group called the Dead, composed of half-zombified stalkers who'd have been interested in Laboratory X-18. There was also another group called Black Slugs, described as bandit-like stalkers in torn-out trench coats, living as outcasts near the borders of the zone. Unfortunately, we have almost no information about these factions, but it is possible that they were also some sort of Dark Stalkers. In any case, it is unknown why exactly the Sin faction and Dark Stalkers were removed from the game. but many speculate it's because they were too similar to the Monolith faction. While it is true that Sin and Monolith are both half-zombified groups who are hostile to pretty much everyone, I think the similarities end there. Many argue that the goals and ideologies of Sin and Monolith are the same. However, I disagree. They don't seem to be interested in secret laboratories for the same reasons, and the source of their faith is different. In one hand we have the Sinners, who believe in the divine essence of the zone as a whole, and in the other hand we have the Monolithians, whose god is simply the Monolith Crystal, but not the entire zone. Besides, Monolithians are actually controlled by the Sea Consciousness, which is actively trying to contain the zone, the opposite of what the Sinners want. To clear up any misconceptions, just know this: the Monolith faction is not defending the zone, but rather the Sea Consciousness located at the Chernobyl power plant, which is working on a way to fight the zone. Or at least that's what we are being told in the good ending of Shadow of Chernobyl. Speaking of ending, the design documents also contain 2 descriptions of a cut ending for the game, featuring the Dark Stalkers. It seems that this was a bad ending, unlocked when the player reached the wish granter with the desire, the thirst for glory. Discharge. Roar. Hands. Knees. The roar of the monolith subsides. Blood. Blood on the walls. Crucified man and emptiness. You are the chosen one. A crucifix in the corner. Above it, on the wall, one word, sin, was spelled out. The inscription was made in blood. The leader swayed and poured the remnants of liquid from his terrible goblet directly into the fire. A suffocating sweet tart smell stupefied the brain. And then they all began to sing, rather hard, and there was so much melancholy in this. And S.T.A.L.K.E.R finally took the place that, obviously, implicitly was his, on the cross. Now that we've presented the original concept of Dark Stalkers, it's time to take a look at some mods that reintroduced them into the game. These mods are Lost Alpha, Oblivion Lost Remake, Legend Returns, and Anomaly. Let us start with this last one. In Anomaly, the Sin faction is depicted as a dark cult worshipping the zone and preaching for the cleansing of the world. If you play as a sinner, you will learn that some of their most notable members are former employees of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R laboratories who worked on the secret experiments. In the mod, the Dark Stalkers are only neutral with the Monolith, and they actually cooperate with them in order to destroy the infidels to their cause, which is everyone else. As explained before, I don't really think Sin and Monolith should be allies, but it is nonetheless the direction this mod decided to take. Here the Sinners are pretty much the same maniacs as Monolithians, except more evil and less heavily geared. Interestingly, their main base is located inside the mine in the Red Forest. Next, let's take a look at Dark Stalkers in Oblivion Lost Remake. This mod aims at recreating the story of Oblivion Lost as it was described in design documents, so the depiction of Sin is quite similar to the known cut content. Based in the army warehouses, the Sinners showcase a large collection of bones and skulls, as well as a few Stalker corpses exposed near the entrance of the complex. Somehow they are not hostile to the player, and in fact you will have to make a few deals with their leaders. First of all, to acquire some secret documents about the X labs which are owned by S.T.A.L.K.E.R. And then to save a few scientists who were captured by the Dark Stalkers and would have been used in their gruesome rituals. In case human flesh could not be found, sinners instead resorted to dead bodies of rats and crows. Lastly, the faction was interested in a psi-protective artifact, which was literally an anomalous skull. The Oblivion Lost remake mod also featured the Black Slugs group, which could be found in the old version of the Dark Valley. They aren't really depicted as Dark Stalkers, yet they have links to the secret X laboratory located under the valley. In fact, the player is tasked by Barkeep to get the code to the lab from the Black Slug's leader, which you can in exchange for a small job. It is not entirely known who the Black Slugs are and what their goal is. However, some have speculated that they could be former test subjects, or even former employees of the lab, which leads us to the mod Lost Alpha, that took a very different approach to the S.T.A.L.K.E.R faction, more in line with what we just saw about the Black Slugs. In Lost Alpha, the Dark Stalkers from S.T.A.L.K.E.R were political prisoners and other outcasts who were used as test subjects for the experiments in the X laboratories. Many of them were transformed into mutants, such as bloodsuckers, but some managed to survive, and they escaped after various disasters struck the labs. However, the horrors that were inflicted to them left the S.T.A.L.K.E.R members deformed and mutated, explaining their appearance of Dark Stalkers. Since then, they have been looking for a way to reverse, or at least improve their condition, which is why they look for any information they can find on X Labs and the secret experiments. In the mod, most sinners, including their leader, are hiding in the old mines located under Darkscape, also an area that was removed from the final game. The player will meet them by accident and will be forced into helping them acquiring data from X18. In general, this version of Sin is much more tragic than the others. No satanic rituals or cannibalism here, only victims of unethical experiments being misunderstood by the rest of Stalkers. Who's the real monster here? Finally, let's take a look at our last mod, Legend Returns. This is probably my favorite depiction of the Sin faction. Cunning and bloody, the Dark Stalkers are back to their evil ways. Indeed, playing as a sinner involves using the skinned faces of deceased Stalkers as a disguise to infiltrate and assassinate the leaders of other factions. And not just one or two leaders, but all of them, as Sin is hostile with absolutely everybody, including the Monolithians. In return, the Dark Stalkers are neutral with almost all the mutants, and believe me, cooperating with bloodsuckers or Buers to assault your enemies is an absolute blast. In this mod, Sin's base is located in the mine in the Red Forest, and the grouping is fully dedicated to venerate and cleanse the zone from the infidels. In addition, they also use human hurts as a trading currency, and their equipment includes Anomalous trenchcoats, weapons and ammunition. Too bad this mod never got a full translation. In fact, Legend Returns also adds the Black Slugs faction, but I could not get much out of it, because every single quest or dialogue was either not translated or missing from the files. At the very least, I can say that the members of Black Slugs are outcast bandits, as well as people who have been marked by the zone. so it's possible that some of them could be similar to Dark Stalkers. It seems that they don't interact much with other Stalkers, as their base is lost in Darkscape in the middle of nowhere. Lastly, let's talk about the prospect of having Dark Stalkers in Stalker 2. I am well aware that we don't really know what's currently going on with the development of the game, but I think the uncertainty should not stop us from discussing and speculating. We know for a fact that new factions are planned for Stalker 2, so considering the popularity of Sin and the fact that devs are actually working on old content previously cut from the original games, such as the Bayoon mutant for example, we can imagine that adding Dark Stalkers should be a no-brainer. But how would the GSC game world implement them? Personally, here's what I would like to see. Being a Dark Stalker is not really a faction, but rather a condition. Dark Stalkers would be normal people who experienced various mutations, affecting their mind and body. The origins of Dark Stalkers and their mutations would be diverse. First of all, the X laboratories. Some Dark Stalkers would have been test subjects, or even employees in the X labs who were affected by the experiments. Then the zone itself. Other Dark Stalkers would simply be people who spent too much time in the zone and near anomalies or psi emissions, basically getting marked by the zone. As a result of their half-mutant nature, Dark Stalkers would be both gifted and cursed. Gifted because their mutations could grant them some special abilities, similar to the powers seen in other mutants. Increased strength and resistance to radiation, telepathy, perhaps immunity to emissions, and who knows what else. But also cursed, because they lost a lot of their humanity and are now struggling to find their place in the Stalker society. Therefore, Dark Stalkers would have turned towards 3 different affiliations. A few of them would be seen as lone hermits, maybe a bit crazy, similarly to Noah, for example. Then there would be those who try to find a cure to their misery. Just like in the model of Stalfa, these Dark Stalkers are desperate to get their humanity back, and are ready to do anything to acquire information from the X laboratories, which perhaps could help with their condition. I think the Dark Stalkers with such a mindset would have their own small faction. The devs could even recycle the name and general idea of Black Slugs and apply it in this case. And finally, there would be Sin. Sin would regroup the Dark Stalkers who decided to embrace their mutant nature, seeing it as a divine gift from the Holy Zone. They would be hostile to all and gruesome in their methods, resorting to bloodthirsty rituals and cannibalism. They would also train and use their mutant powers to their full extent, compensating their poor equipment with anomalous abilities. In my opinion, this would make for unique and interesting enemies to fight. In any case, Dark Stalkers would be quite rare, and most inhabitants of the zone would only think of them as legends rather than real people. I guess duty would try to hunt them down, and it could be tied to a questline. But hey, it's just me rambling over nothing. All of this will probably never happen. What about you? Do you think Dark Stalkers could be in Stalker 2? How do you personally would like to see them depicted? Let me know in the comments below. And now this video has come to an end. Thank you very much for watching, Stalker, and goodbye.